today. Yes, I'm going to talk about the real world. So as we heard from Brad and JP at the opening of the meeting, there are lots of good theoretical, mathematical tools that allow us to establish Pareto-efficient Ramseyan bliss points. And the Ramsey bliss point, for those who aren't familiar with it, is a mathematical point whereby perfect social utility is achieved for the producer and the user, for everybody, forever. Nice idea. And I think even the mathematicians and the economists would accept that that's a bit of a dream. So much as we talk about how we can measure value, how we can express value, I think many of the speakers over the last couple of days have also made it clear that the reality is that people are involved in this process. And as soon as people are involved in this process, the people bit comes in. And that means that the discussion very quickly becomes a tug of war between two extremes. And those two extremes tend to be, how can we achieve the most public good, against those who said, what's the right amount of profit to make sure that this is sustainable? And of course, that tug of war is influenced by numbers, but it's very often influenced by a lot of other things. What's our worldview? What's most important to us? What are our motivations, and where does that mix of motivations bring us on that continuum between profit and public good? What are our ideologies? What's our recent experience? What time frame are we thinking? Are we thinking short term? Usually. We should be thinking medium, and we should be thinking very long term. If we think about the vaccine development, production and supply cycle, we should be thinking 10, 20, 30 years forward, but that's not easy to do for us. Who employs us? Who funds us? And what are their success metrics? And if your funder and your employer is political, they often want something short, easy to remember, easy to express, and impactful. What are the means at your disposal? How much do you have to spend? And of course, we tend to be cognitively conservative or cognitively lazy. And so small, simple, easy things like price are often very attractive metrics for us. The reality, as we all know, is that kind of polarization is false. That actually the stakeholder value, the public health impact, is really important. It's only with a healthy population that we can have a healthy economy and have the shareholder impact and the best return on our investment. And the healthier our economy is, of course, the more we have to invest in our population and our healthy population. And so we can get into this virtuous spiral. So what about vaccines? What's success look like for vaccination? What would value look like for vaccination? So I would suggest that it looks a bit like this. It's a triangle. That, of course, we all want vaccines to be affordable. To have a vaccine for HIV, TB and malaria in our pocket and not be able to afford it would be no good. But I think we should also be clear that affordability and low price are very different things, and I'll come back to that. We need vaccine supply. We want it to be high quality. We want it to be reliable. And we want enough. And to have enough, that means we probably need to have too much, because having just the right amount is a bit of a challenge. We don't want too little. The moment we have too much supply, though, of course, we start to get into the supply and demand situation. If a producer is producing too much, then there's a temptation for the purchaser to say, oh, I can push that price down there. So you can get into a very difficult yo-yo situation. And of course, we need to be thinking not just short term. Again, we need to be thinking medium and long term. And we want innovation. And I don't mean just innovation in new vaccines. We want innovation in everything. We want innovation in the supply chain. We want innovation in how we plan, how we value, how we fund, how we finance. But we need to think of that in terms of incentives and rewards. And we need to think, why should someone be working on vaccines rather than working, for instance, on cancer? And I'll come back to that. So it's a balance. It's a balance between those 3 points on the triangle. If we focus just on affordability, we're probably going to hurt quality and innovation. If we focus just on innovation, we may make things too expensive for anybody. And if we focus just on quality, we may lose the other two. So how do we find this beast in the middle, this mythical beast, the unicorn? And it's a balance. So how do we achieve that balance? The first thing we have to realize is that we're working in a complex and asymmetric ecosystem. We have the ecosystem here that funds itself and finances itself, and we have the ecosystem down here that has a range of subsidy from everything to a little bit. In the self-funding and financing, you have governments and organizations that directly procure their vaccines, and they do it with funds that they've generated themselves from tax, for instance. You have the producers who fund innovation, who fund manufacturing, and who sell to a whole range of customers, from individual countries through to the large buyers. And then you have the philanthropic and the public health organizations, which of course are only possible if you're in an ecosystem that generates excess wealth that can be invested into philanthropy and can be invested into public health. And that then feeds down into the subsidized group, where you have a small number of very large procurement agencies using a lot of donor fiscal space, procuring from producers who keep their costs low by focusing on the manufacturing in low-cost areas. And of course, as well as that, we would like the technology to find its way down from the north to the south of this diagram, not necessarily geographically. So, what can be the potential unintended consequences of getting those 3 points of the triangle wrong? Let's look at the affordability matrix. I want to start off by talking about oil, crude oil. So in 2007, just before the market crash, the price of crude oil was about $160 a barrel. Why? Because the world was just in perpetual growth. The boom and bust had gone, and we expected industrial output, especially from China, to go on increasing. So we were going to use up all the oil, and it's going to become very expensive. The world crashed, the price went down to about $30 a barrel. Why? Because nobody was going to work anymore. We didn't need any oil before. And then it came back and it settled out as about $100 a barrel. Now that was a pain for us who had to buy petrol for our cars, but actually that had some very positive effects. Car producers invested in electric cars, engines became much more efficient, and we saw oil-producing countries suddenly become economic powers. That was very good, except for OPEC. OPEC weren't very happy with that because a number of things were happening. Most importantly, the US was well on the way to becoming self-sufficient in oil again. Why? Because extracting oil from oil shale became cost-effective. And they weren't happy with that, so they wanted to stop that happening. So they opened up the taps, poured the oil into the market, supply outstripped demand, and the price started to come down. And what that meant here is that, what you see here is different countries. In dark is the cost, the capital cost of investing in oil exploration and oil extraction, and this is the cost of getting that barrel out. And what you can see as the price comes down, it becomes cost inefficient for a lot of those countries. You'll notice that the OPEC countries at the bottom here, so they could push that price down a long way and lose some of these countries. And we've seen the negative impact that has had on countries, Venezuela, lots of countries you can think of, that were doing very well economically because of the high oil. And there are two things I want to take away from that. One is that low price can be as dangerous as high price. And the second is that different business models are sensitive to prices in different ways. And so let's look at vaccine producers. And there are essentially two kinds of vaccine producers. There are those vaccine producers that invest significantly in R&D. They're often in high-income countries, and that means the production facilities cost more money, the people cost more money, and so their cost of goods is higher. There are others in lower-income settings who invest far less in R&D. Building a production facility costs less than the cost of sales there. This is not in any way a criticism of those two models. They're just different business models. But just as when the price of crude oil comes down, you can see that if you set a single price for the same vaccine and you start to push it down, the margins start to come down. And you can see who's going to get in trouble first for those vaccines. So what can they do about it? Well, the first thing you can do as your margins come down is look for economies of scale. So what do? You merge. So if we look at vaccine producers, we've been in a downward curve for a long time. Back in the 70s, there were liability issues in the US, which saw the number of producers go from tens to single digits. Then there were regulatory demands, perfectly legitimate regulatory demands that forced some producers out because they couldn't afford the costs of upgrading their quality systems. And then we see the effect of price pressure. So we're now left with probably 5 or 6 global vaccine producers that invest significantly in R&D. So we're into an oligopolist situation. And that's not necessarily an oligopolist situation which has come about because people want to dominate the world. It's a reaction to the market. The other thing that sometimes you have to do is say, well, it's no longer viable. I'm going to have to leave that vaccine. So if we look back over the last few years, we can see that a number of producers have exited measles-containing vaccines. And that leaves us with a single global supplier of measles rubella vaccine. There's effectively only one reliable supplier of yellow fever vaccine, probably thanks to the fact that there is tier pricing for that producer that the other producers don't have access to. If you look at the rabies supply situation, that's pretty concerning. And those of you who follow snake venoms will know that the pressure on prices forced producers of snake venoms out and left people purchasing just from very low-cost snake antivenoms. Unfortunately, we discovered that those antivenoms didn't work. And so by the time the people that were purchasing those at low prices came back to those who previously produced them, they'd gone. And I'll talk about that again in a minute. So if we look then, what's happened in terms of the supply situation? So between 2001 and 2014, the number of suppliers supplying UNICEF has gone up. That's great, from 13 to 16. And in fact, it's very positive to see that those more commoditized producers, the number of those has gone up. So I think that was the goal, and that's very positive. However, if you dig deeper and you look at the number of vaccines that have just a single supplier, you can see that number has gone up. And you can also see that that's primarily one producer. Now, that producer is quite rightfully congratulated for the amazing job they do, but it is a single producer. And anybody who's wanting to supply a global market, anybody who knows how difficult it is to reliably produce vaccines will know that that's a risk for us to take. Now, we often get optimistic about this, and I just want to show this is the yellow fever supply forecast from UNICEF. A yellow flag is moderately good, a green flag is very good, and a red flag is not good. This was the projection in 2014, which said, well, we're not fantastic this year, we won't be good next year. In 2016, all will be wonderful. Those of you who had followed yellow fever this year will know that 2016 was not wonderful. But of course, the war will be over by Christmas. But actually, I don't believe that 2017, 2018 will be like that. I think if you dig down into the fundamental root cause of yellow fever supply issue, it's not going away anytime soon. So let's move on to innovation, the second point of the triangle. Now, the problem is that there isn't a steward. There's nobody out there saying, are we doing enough innovation globally on vaccines? And innovation is normally something that the market is in charge of looking after. A healthy market will attract innovation, an unhealthy market will push innovation and push investment elsewhere. So let's just have a look, how are we doing? So this is going to clinicaltrials.gov, taking all the trials that are done in clinicaltrials.gov, taking all of those that do with vaccines and looking at what the proportion of all studies that are on vaccines, who's doing them and where they're doing them. So the first thing you notice is that since 2005, the percentage of all clinical trials being done that are being done on vaccines has fallen from 1.2% to 0.2%. In terms of who's doing those, you'll see that the multinational companies, as we've seen this contraction of companies, the number of trials that they're doing has halved. Rightly or wrongly, some of that slack has been taken up by academic and NGO money, and there's a little bit of an uptick there in the biotech area. Where is it happening? Well, the North American, European activity has gone down, and there's been an uptick in Asian activity. What are those studies being done on? And what you can see is if you look at all those studies, close to 50% of all those studies are done on HIV, TB, and malaria because of fantastic investment primarily coming from the Gates Foundation. So that means that the rest of the vaccines are squeezed into the rest of that money and that activity. And we have to ask ourselves if that looks like enough activity for some of the important public health targets. One of the most telling indicators of how healthy a market is where the venture capitalists are putting their money. They will spend hours sitting with you, digging into your pipeline, and they will do it on multiple occasions until they really understand it, and they'll do it with everybody. They're incredibly smart people, incredibly focused people, incredibly detail-orientated. And what you can see is that their decisions on where they're putting their money has changed significantly over the last few years. Yellow is gene therapy, the green is preventative vaccines, and the purple is therapeutic vaccines. So the venture capital money is going primarily into oncological immunotherapy. That's where they see the opportunity. And you can see there's been a plateau in preventative vaccine money. So the venture capital guys are not convinced that there's good return for their investment in vaccines. What about quality? Well, there aren't really quality metrics. Quality is a binary thing. Your vaccine either passes or it fails. And there's nowhere that I'm aware of that you can go and look up and see how many are passing, how many fail. And it's also very difficult to identify a sort of continuous parameter that you look at to ask yourself, is market pressure having an adverse effect on quality? Really difficult question. So I just want to take the snake venoms as an example. This is a slide from MSF. And their conclusion is there's been a market failure for snake antivenoms. Why? First of all, people haven't thought enough about snake bite victims because of where it happens. There's been very poor understanding of the global concept of cost effectiveness, that cheap snake antivenoms doesn't necessarily mean they're effective and you've got a sustainable market. The demand, as you can see, has gone up and down and up and down. There were no quality requirements. And actually, because this market was so unwell, there's been no investment. And we're still basically using the technology that these gentlemen behind me developed a few years ago, and you can see them gathered around a horse there. So what can we do about it? What are the gaps we need to fill? So let's go back to our triangle. In terms of affordability, we need to insist that affordability is more than just price. It's about a more holistic measure of impact in terms of supply reliability, in terms of innovation, in terms of the number of producers want, the new vaccines that we want. And we want to try and maintain a healthy market. That's an easy thing to say. The vaccine market is not a normal market. But we need to try and achieve a healthy market. And I think one of the things I've noticed here is we have a lot of health economists, but I'm not sure we have many market economists. And I think it would be very helpful for us to have people who have a more holistic view of markets and why markets work and why they don't work, and what we might do differently. And I'll come back to that in a second. In terms of quality, of course, the moment quality has gone, we have a problem, a huge problem. Because if quality problems result in ineffective vaccines, dangerous vaccines, and loss in confidence, getting back from that will be really difficult. So what are we doing to check that we're not heading in that direction? I'm not suggesting we are, but it's because I don't know. What can we do to check for that? And then in terms of innovation, we need to be very clear about what we want a list of what we want and just check, are we pushing and are we pulling towards what we want? If we are, great. If we're not, let's make sure we've got things in place that are. So let's look at that. Let's look at the areas where we might like to protect and increase value, what that means in terms of the profit side of the equation, the return on investment, what that means in terms of the public health side of the equation, and what are some of the tactics that we might be able to use. So in terms of research, we all want lower costs, and we're all quite happy to share costs. We all want lower risk, and we're all quite happy to share risk. And of course, we all want products that are adapted to health needs. So there's no argument there. What can we do? We need to make sure we've got the right push mechanisms in place and make sure we've got the right incentives as well. But that probably comes a little bit later. In terms of development, we want predictable demand. So when we start developing a product, we want to know that it's going to be needed, that it's going to be used. And we've heard some cases today where that hasn't necessarily happened. Of course, the public health community want affordable prices, and as I said, we want affordable prices. There's no point producing a vaccine that nobody can afford. So what are the pull mechanisms in there? Is that can we predefine the market? Can we make it clear that market is waiting for someone as long as they'll invest in the development? And AMC and Gavi are good examples of pull mechanisms that are already in place. Is there anything else we can do? In terms of production, we'd all like lower cost of goods, we'd all like to be able to produce more vaccine, and we'd all like supply security. So is there any way we can reward that? Is there any way to subsidize? What can we do to make sure that we do better on all of that? And in quality, it's absolutely a shared goal to protect our trust and confidence, to have reliable safety. And so do we have the right regulatory tools in place? Do we have the right metrics in place to see where we're going with that? There are then some other very simple things that we can do in terms of how vaccines are procured that we don't necessarily do. So this is a supply power, demand power grid. So think of it in terms of a car producer. If I'm a car producer and I'm buying little metal O-rings, then I have huge demand power, and there are hundreds of O-ring producers out there, so the supply has low power. So actually, I can treat it as a commodity. I just say, who can give me the best price for 1 million O-rings? If I'm buying an engine management system, however, I need that in 3 to 5 years' time, and there are very few producers of that. So if I'm BMW, I need to sit down with Bosch, and I need to say, my new BMW 13 series is going to need this engine management system. And you co-develop it together. Now, we have to be very careful with vaccines and decide, are they commodities or are they engine management systems? If they're engine management systems, we need to co-develop them. If we think they're O-rings, then okay, treat them as a commodity, but there are great dangers in treating things as commodities. So I just want to finish with a thought from Schopenhauer. The problem with all these things is it's very hard to think long term, and often we only realize that we got it wrong when it's not there anymore. So thank you very much.